Hello everybody, this is the second part of the first lecture. So the second part is pretty much solely on research, so conducting research in social psychology, and it sort of applies to research in general in psychology. So let's look at these statements. And so the greater cohesiveness or solidarity of a group, the better the decisions it will be. People are less aggressive if they've recently released their tensions by aggressing versus people who don't do that. Promising and delivering rewards to people for doing an enjoyable activity should, in the long run, make them enjoy the activity even more. Depressed individuals have unrealistic images of themselves and their abilities. If you are truly innocent, you have nothing to fear from taking a lie detector test. So think about these statements. Do you think that these statements are true? In some ways, it doesn't matter what you think, but these are widely held beliefs, even probably now. And these are just displayed because each of these beliefs has been contradicted by research, which means that research has shown that these statements are incorrect. So we'll see in our group work chapter, which should be next week, groups that see themselves as cohesive and full of solidarity, they actually make very bad decisions. Groups make bad decisions in general, but especially if they see themselves as cohesive and have solidarity. There's an old idea that you can let out all your anger, and once you let it out, it's gone, and then you won't be angry to the next person. Well, that's wrong. If you're aggressive in general. This is a particularly important one. As I tell people in my intro class, I'd say that the worst thing you can do with a kid, for example, is to give them an external reward for something that they like. So if they like something, let's say they like reading, and let's say, you think, I want them to read more, I'm going to give them a cookie every time they read a book. Well, once you do that, you shift the motivation from internal, I like doing it, to I'm doing it for the cookie. That's really bad. You should just kind of let them, you can encourage the enjoyment without having to try to bribe them with external rewards. Depressed individuals, that the main cause of depression is not having an unrealistic image of themselves. And the last one, I hope you don't think a lie detector test is a lie detector test. It's just a physiological test. For example, you can take somebody who's a cold-blooded killer and you give them a lie detector test and they'll be able to lie. There's certain people in the public view that lie probably 100 times a day. I fully believe if you hooked up that person to a lie detector test, they would pass it. Because lying is second nature to that person I'm thinking of. So lie detector test in both ways. Just because it says that you're not lying doesn't mean you aren't. And if it says you're lying, it doesn't mean you're necessarily lying. You might just be nervous. And so I hate that term lie detector test because there's no such thing. So anyway, all of these statements that are widely held in our culture, I think, have been rejected by research, actual careful research. So this just shows that we should do research because we can't just sort of say, well, that's obvious. Well, anything's obvious after you've done it. So if you run a study, and this is pretty common in this class, for example, is you could read a study and you could say, well, I knew that already. Why'd they bother to do the study? I already knew it. Well, no, probably not. You could have presented you with something that was research and said totally the opposite thing. You'd say the same thing. You'd say, I knew that already. Why'd they bother doing the research? You do the research because there's a lot of things that people believe that aren't true. Okay, then continuing on. Again, we do research because You don't know just by beliefs. You have to do the research. And so, for example, you could look at, the nice thing about research is you can actually understand what's going on. So it's not just about whether something is there. Research really should go into why is it happening. And so there's something called hindsight bias, which is basically we overestimate our ability to predict something after the event is over. So I know it would happen. So there's different components to that. So we know through research that people have hindsight bias. Once something happens, they say, oh yes, I knew that would happen. I always knew that would happen, blah, blah. Well, no, you didn't. How does it work? So there's different parts of it. So there could be memory distortion. I told you what would happen. So people who have hindsight bias, they think that they told somebody that they knew it, or they thought it. Oh, I always thought that. Well, maybe not. Maybe your memory is not quite working well. There's views of inevitability. It just had to happen. So we have this belief that things are inevitable. They're going to happen anyway. That's part of this hindsight bias. And then foreseeability. So people have this idea that they had a feeling it would happen. So I foresaw this. And so hindsight bias is there. We know it's there. But these are what I'd call the processes. This is why it happens. We distort our memory. We have these beliefs about inevitability. And we think that somehow we had a strong feeling it would happen. So you just trust my feelings. I can feel things that are going to happen. So again, research is done not only to see if something's there, but why something is there, how it's happening. So scientific methodology, you probably already know this coming in, but we should cover it anyway. And in social psychology, they want replication. We'll talk more about this issue later. And also, when we do research, we subject it to peer review. What does that mean? It means that we can't just do research and say, oh, here it is. It has to go through a process of other researchers who know the topic that you're researching, evaluating your research to see if it is done essentially properly. And in journals, when you hear the term peer-reviewed journals, those articles only appear in a journal if it's gone through this rigorous process of several researchers reading it. Usually what happens is, in short, an editor gets the article. The editor will assign usually 3 peer reviewers. So these are researchers who have published on the topic of the article, of the research. Those 3 people independently, meaning that they don't know what the other people are thinking about the article. So you independently read the article, or I should say the research, and then you make your comments. So you make specific comments. It could be things like this was done well, or it could be things like this was not done well. And then you're asked to, as a peer reviewer, you're asked to give essentially usually 3 judgments. The most rare judgment is, this looks great, publish it right away. That's really rare. The 2 more likely outcomes are, this looks good, and publish this if the person makes substantial changes that I've listed. And then it has to go through another review process. So if that's the choice, then the person doesn't get published right away. They have to actually revise those things, and then other peer reviewers will read that to make sure that those revisions have taken place. There's actually 2 other ones. So there's one that is, this is not very good. If you feel like it, go back and make substantial revisions, huge revisions, and you can possibly resubmit here. And then the worst one is, this is a load of crap, don't even bother sending it to us again. We don't think it's good enough to even look at again, even after you revise it. So there's basically those decisions. And typically, most of the decisions are revision, or rejection. So those are the most common. And so it's a pretty rigorous process that you have to go through to get research published. And then when you're doing research in general, this is not the peer review part, this is just research in general, is that you're supposed to be skeptical throughout. So you're supposed to never sort of believe fully what you believe in. You're always supposed to question your findings, your data, your beliefs, because it's really easy to interpret your data in line with what you think. So it's very dangerous. So that's what this quote is saying basically, is don't be so influenced by your beliefs. You should try to challenge your beliefs and make sure you're looking for things that can falsify or reject your claims. And then once you do that, if you still have support for your claims, then you should feel good about it. So you probably already know this little scientific method chart. So you start with a research question. Then you generate hypotheses. So research questions are more general. And then hypotheses are more specific statements that come from the research question that you can test empirically. Empirically means through data, through observations, through some sort of measurement. Once you have your hypotheses, then you do your methodology. Your method is how you collect your data. And how you collect your data should reflect your hypotheses, the variables in your hypotheses. So once you collected your data, then you analyze the data, and that's through, that's called results. So you have your data, you have to do statistical analyses for your data to see if they support or don't support your hypotheses. Then what you do is you have to move more broadly. You have to move to what does these results, what do these research findings, what do these statistical findings actually mean in the real world, and that's conclusions discussion. Actually, that part is like an hourglass. So I think I'm gonna pause this real quick. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to just draw the hourglass just to illustrate it. Here we go. So that process of research that we just went through, that first sort of part of it, is like an hourglass. So you know an hourglass is broad on the two ends, and then the sand goes in the middle here. And so the research question is pretty broad. The hypotheses are a little bit more specific. Then your method is very specific. So this is the nitty-gritty about how you collect your data. And then the results, so when you're doing your statistics, it's also nitty-gritty. It's just the very specific detail, very specific statistical test that you're running on your specific data. Then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to do your discussion. And your discussion takes those specific results and says, for example, how do they address the hypotheses? Are the hypotheses supported or not? And then you want to do more broad, is what does it mean in the real world? So here we care about the real world. So who cares about just data? It should have something to say about how people actually behave and act. And then the broader one is when you generate more research questions. So when you write a research article, the last part of your conclusion discussion section is, okay, I did this research, but this research has raised or pointed to other issues. So you never end in research. You're always finding out some pieces, but there's new pieces to find out. So this is like future research. So that's really broad. So the process of research is that. It's like an hourglass. You go general to more specific. This is really the nitty-gritty of the research, of collecting data, analyzing data. But then you don't always want to stop there. You always want to say what does the data mean in terms of your theory that you presented earlier, but also how does it apply to the real world. And then finally, the most broad part of that is thinking about future research. What are the future research questions we should look at after you found out what you found out in this research here, this specific study? So that's the process of research. And then once this is basically, this part right here is the study that you do, then what happens is if you want to disseminate it, so disseminate means you want to say, hey, I did this research, people should know about it. You go through the peer review process that we talked about earlier. Then you get published, hopefully. And people read your study, and then they get curious about whether they can replicate it. Replicate means if they did the same study, would they find the same types of findings? Would they find the same statistical relationships? And then if people start replicating your study, they find the same things that you found doing roughly the same methodology, then you have consensus. So if a bunch of people redo your research and they find the same things, then you can say, well, there's really something there because other people have done it. So there's a consensus, there's a group of people who've done it, and the majority of people who've done it said it's there. That's consensus. More broadly, what I'll say is in psychology, we don't usually do like specific replication. Why is that? Because it's not like other fields where you can just run study after study after study because you have physical materials, you just rerun it, you have a machine, you might collect this thing, do that thing. It's really easy to do. In psychology, it takes a lot more time to do research because we usually need people. There's animal research, but that even takes a long time. But people research takes a long time because you gotta get people to come into your study. You gotta think about how you're gonna pay for them in the study. Are you gonna give them credit in class, etc.? There's all these issues. And doing people, it takes a long time. A person comes in, it's gonna take you maybe 30 minutes to 2 hours to get data from just one person. So if you want 50 people, that turns into a much longer period of time to collect data. And so we usually don't do replication in that sense because we don't have that time. We can't do things quickly. Also, it's a little bit unnecessary. What we want to do is we want to think about different ways that we can do the research. So if you have a research question and hypotheses, there's different methodologies you could use. You could use questionnaires. You could ask a friend to report on that person, what they're like. You could do a lab experiment. You could observe people in the real world. You could dig around in their archives of social media. So you ask them permission to look at their social media and analyze it. Or you could ask them, give us permission to analyze your text. So your text messages. So people have done that type of research. And so there's different ways to gather your data. There's different ways to design studies to answer the same hypotheses and research questions. And so really the point in psychology is that we just don't replicate. We actually prefer that there's different researchers using different research methodologies, different measures of the variables. Different measures could be, again, you could do a questionnaire, you could ask their friends, you could observe them in the real world, you could observe them in a lab setting. There's different ways to get data about people. And so what we really like is we like if different people are answering the same research questions and hypotheses using different research methods and measures, and if they find similar results, similar findings, then we have a very strong argument about what's going on. It's not just a simple replication that I did the same exact thing you did. We did it a bunch of different ways, and all those different ways with different researchers doing it said basically the same thing. Then we have a really strong argument that that stuff is really real. I should say real, but that stuff is really something that's going on. Something that's influential in people's behaviors. And we call this a nomological network. So unlike replication, which is again doing the same study over and over again, see if people get the same thing, a nomological network approach is this. Different people doing it differently, they say the same things. They're finding the same stuff. Then we can really start saying that something's going on here. And this is really the pinnacle of it. If you can have a strong nomological network around your research question, then there's really strong evidence that it's something that's important to look at. One thing to remember about research, and if you've studied the philosophy of science, you cannot prove anything. This is, let me get this thing off of here. This is something that I'm always kind of constantly correcting students about, is that they want us write in papers that this study proves this, or research proves this, and this is a fact. No, there's no such things. You can't prove anything. And what we really want to do is we want falsifiability. So for one, we shouldn't say that we're proving stuff. We say the data or findings support the hypothesis, but we don't say prove. Also, we look for falsification, which means that we shouldn't look for evidence that we're right. We should look for evidence that we're wrong. So this is what this Einstein quote is saying. So you can't do, there's no way you can prove you're right. There's no such thing as proof and right in science. It's only we get better understandings of things. And I've actually had fights with people, more probably lay people, but people who should know better. When I say that there's no, in terms of research, there's no facts. They can't stand that idea, and I've had fights with people over that, which is really weird. But that's what science is we don't have facts. We have better understandings of things, but we never are arrogant enough to say that we know exactly what's going on. So that's what Einstein's saying, is that research cannot prove that you're right. But we also want to say that there's falsifiability. And so we have to open ourselves up to be wrong. And so if there's something that shows us we're wrong, we have to eat it and say we're wrong, and we have to sort of modify our theory based on that evidence. So this is really kind of an important part of science, is that there's no such thing as proof or facts, just better understandings, and there's a sense that we should not look for confirming evidence, but we should look for falsifying evidence, because we should play a fair game. We shouldn't rig the data to prove us right, quote unquote. We should look for falsifying evidence and deal with it if we find it. So just some definitions here. So a variable or conceptual variable is just what that thing is in terms of concept, means like theories. So what I'll say is, for example, there's a conceptual variable, let's say, of narcissism, and we can define narcissism theoretically as somebody who's has a high opinion of themselves. They put other people down to make themselves feel better. They're defensive. They have a very vulnerable sense of themselves. So they go around saying that they're the smartest person in the world, but they're extremely sensitive. If anybody challenges that, they get very angry. So that's a conceptual definition. Operational is how we measure it. So there's different ways we can measure that. We could give a questionnaire, and we could have questions that try to tap into those aspects of the conceptual variable, and that would be our operational definition about how we measured it. We measured it through self-reports, assessing 1, 2, 3, 4, these things I just mentioned. Or we could measure it with observations. So we could have an observational situation where we have a lab and we have somebody do something, and we have observational questions that each observer will rate the person on terms of those qualities that we just defined in the conceptual variable. So operational definition is how we actually measure it. So the conceptual variable shouldn't change in the sense that that's from some sort of theory, and if we have some evidence of that theory, then that concept is the same regardless of your research. What differs in the research is actually how you measure it and how you actually study it. So operational is how you do your research. Here's another example. So let's just say texting while driving is your conceptual variable. It's pretty straightforward as a conceptual variable. You can measure it with self-report. So you could ask questions about how often you text and drive. You could do observations. In California, observing this, you probably would get like a 40% rate at least of people texting while driving. So you could just drive around, and you could randomly select which roads and which freeways you'd go on. But you could just basically observe people texting and driving. Or you could ask somebody's friend, so somebody who obviously is in the car a lot with the person. So nominate a friend who rides in the car with you for at least 10 hours a week or something like that. And then you could contact that friend, and you could have the friend answer questions about how much that person texts and drives. So the concept is the same. How you measure it will differ based on your decisions in terms of how you want to do your research. Let's talk about some different types of research methods. So there's observational, there's correlational, experimental. So observational is pretty straightforward. So observational is you go out and you watch. I should say go out, but you watch something. So naturalistic observation is conducting research in a real life setting. So actually watching people in real life. You have to be a little bit careful about this. You have to be careful that you're not violating people's privacies and all this other stuff. The example I like to give on this is I had a student in a research methods class at another college, and it's a more of a 4-year residential college, and they had some sort of funny hypothesis about public displays of affection, and their hypothesis was pretty simple. It would be more prevalent during the nighttime versus the daytime, and their methodology was that they would go to the college coffee shop and watch people, and they had a coding system about touching. So touching somebody's hand, touching somebody's shoulder, touching somebody's arm, touching somebody's leg. So they had a whole coding system in terms of the intimacy that was being displayed. So this student would sit in this coffee shop and code couples displays of affection based on their observational thing. She didn't have to inform people, so she didn't have to go up and say, "Hey, I'm watching you," and she didn't go up afterwards either. So she didn't have to debrief people. She didn't say, "Hey, I was watching you." That could lead to some weirdness, but we don't do it because of weirdness. We do it because in terms of ethics, you would consider that public behavior. So people are in a coffee shop, but if whatever they're doing, everybody in the coffee shop can see. So in terms of ethics, in situations like that, you don't need to inform people there in your research or even debrief them. So that's naturalistic. It was real life. People didn't know they were being studied, and it's actually strong in that way, so you don't have any reactivity. Sometimes if people know they're being studied, they act weird and different. The downfall of naturalistic observation is that it can be something that is very hard to control. So if you're in the real world, there's a lot of things happening. So there's different people in the coffee shop coming and going, and there's different noise or different music on the speaker. There's all these things that you can't control, and so there's so many things that are going on that you may not be certain that the variable that you're studying is actually changing people's behavior. There's so many other things that you are going on that you aren't aware of and you can't control systematically. So just like with any research methodology, there's pros and cons. There's also observational methods. This is referring to different things. I'm going to do two things here. This is not all in the notes here. And so the observational methodology, you can do lab studies. So you can do observations in labs. And so you might not necessarily be manipulating any variables. So it's not an experiment, but you're observing people still in labs. And so a common thing that's done in, like, let's say relationship research is you can bring a couple in a lab, and then what you do is when you bring them in, you usually keep them separate. You ask them to fill out like a little survey, and the survey can be like, what are the 5 topics that you argue the most about? So each partner lists 5 topics that they argue about, and then what the researcher does, the researcher looks at those 2 surveys, and then they pick one of those topics that the people agreed upon, that they fight about. And then they basically say, okay, you're in this room, we want you to discuss this topic, one of the things that they fight about. And then you don't do anything else, you just leave the room and let them talk. And so you obviously record their interaction. You can then do all sorts of analysis and data collection in terms of what people do when they're arguing. And you can look at different variables in terms of how people communicate, what they do to each other, how they interact. And then you can also look at the outcomes. So there could be an outcome of resolution. So there's a good resolution, people feel good about it, or it's not resolved. So you can actually correlate then the things that people did in their interaction and whether it was resolved or not, whether the conflict was resolved or not. So that would be a lab example of an observation. There's also this thing that is right here, ethnography. This is very close to a naturalistic observation, I'd say, actually. So it's actually somebody outside of a group or a culture, and they observe it from the inside. Anthropology does this type of work, cultural anthropology specifically. So there's some famous examples of this. So there's some anthropologists who've joined gangs, and basically they get the gang leader to approve their participation in this, and they write about gang culture. There's always obviously these famous things about like going to the Amazon rainforest, the Yamanano, it's a tribe there, and have an anthropologist join the tribe. And the idea with that type of research is that you have some objectivity of an outsider as the researcher, but then you also get a little bit of insight in terms of being somebody in that group or that culture and what it's like to be within that culture or group. Also, some observational methods are what's called archival. So it says documents or archives of culture. So you could look at, here we have TV shows. So you could look at TV shows and the content of TV shows. You could look at movies, the content of movies. Archives could also include things that individuals have. So one of the interesting methodologies, which probably can't be used much nowadays, but in the old days, people used to keep diaries, especially women or girls, and there's been a lot of interesting diary studies. And so people have dug up old diaries and analyzed them for various issues that they want to study. And those are kind of interesting because, again, people don't know they're being studied. And so there's not this reactivity that people act differently because they're being studied, because they don't know they're being studied. And so it's a little bit more realistic, but it's a little bit more sloppy because trying to collect data is a little bit more iffy because the person's just acting and producing something. So it may take some time to get the data that you need. Let me go back to sorry about this. I didn't do that for the lab observations. Lab observations, good thing is that you have a lot more control. So unlike the naturalistic observation where you're in the real world where so many things are happening, with a lab observation, you're controlling things. So there's not other people in the area, there's nothing happening, there's nothing on TV, there's no music, there's nothing else going on except the two people are talking or fighting about that issue that you're having them talk about. So there's a lot more control. So you don't have to worry about other things influencing behavior. The bad thing about it is, actually I'm trying to think of some bad things. Some people might say it's artificial. But I've known a lot of observational lab researchers, and they'll tell you tons of stories about how maybe if initially people act kind of odd for the first minute or two, but then, boy, it's just like they're acting at home. They forget the cameras are there, everything. Um, so it actually ends up being usually pretty naturalistic. This is especially true if you're dealing with couples or families or groups. Um, One person might act differently, but if you have a couple people interacting, they tend to go back into their natural patterns pretty quickly. Ethnography, I didn't do the pros and cons of that. The pros is theoretically, like I said, you have both perspectives. You have the perspective of the expert researcher, but then you have also the perspective of an insider. So you're able to balance those two things and have basically the best of both worlds. The negative side of the cons of it is, a lot of people have challenged this methodology in terms of the behavior of people. So are they acting natural around you? Are they actually being truthful with you when they tell you what's going on? Also, there's a lot of criticism in terms of you could lose your objectivity. So you feel somehow you start identifying with the group, and that compromises your objectivity in terms of being a researcher who's trying to analyze it more intellectually. You kind of fall into the cultural patterns, and you lose your researcher perspective. I think I just did the archival analysis in terms of pros and cons. Let's look at correlational research. I don't really like this term, but let's just roll with it because this is something that they use in social psychology. And basically with correlational research, we're correlating two or more variables together, and those variables are not manipulated. What does that mean? It means that it's just how people are acting in the real world. So you as a researcher are essentially measuring what's going on in the real world without you doing anything to influence people's behaviors. If you're doing something to influence people's behaviors, that's called an experiment. So if you're doing what's called a manipulation to see if whatever you changes people's behavior, that's an experiment. Correlational research is referring to situations where you're measuring things, but you're measuring those things as they occur in the real world without any manipulation by you, any changes by you. And correlation, they go from +1 to -1. So we'll go over this in a second. There's slides that go into it specifically. And so there's a positive correlation. So positive correlation means that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes up. So let's just look at time studying and grades. Probably there's a fairly positive correlation between how much you study and your grade in a class. We can probably all agree with that. And so positive just means basically if you look at this, let's say this is your grade would be here usually, because that's your outcome. So grade is this axis, and then studying would be this. So here would be less studying, more studying. Here would be a lower grade, higher grade. So positive correlation means that the more you study, the more you go down here, the higher your grade is. So you can see that not much studying, low grade. Some studying, okay grade. A little bit more studying, a little bit higher grade. A lot of studying, a high grade. So that's what a positive is. As one increases, the other increases. As the other decreases, the other one decreases. So they go hand to hand. And this is just showing the strength of the correlation. So something that has a perfect correlation is that all the dots are people. So if you took every single person in class and measured how much they studied, and then found out their grade in the class, each dot is a person. So this person studied this much and got this grade. This person, this dot, studied this much, got this grade. So if everybody falls in that line, it's called perfect. there's a step-by-step. Study a bit more, this much more, you're going to get this bigger of a grade. Study this much more, you're going to get this bigger of a grade. It goes step by step. If the dots are around that line, and they're pretty close to it, it's a high correlation, high positive correlation in this case. If the dots are kind of scattered off that line, there's some messiness. It's still a correlation, still a positive correlation, but it's not as strong. So strength of correlation basically is how much people are linking to this line. How far are they from the line? That's positive. One goes higher, the other goes higher. One goes lower, the other goes lower. Negative is still a relationship, but it's in the opposite direction. So as one gets higher, the other one gets lower. So let's look at absences and grade. So the higher your absences, what do you think the grade is going to be? It's probably going to be lower. So absences go higher, grade goes lower. Absences go down, absences get lower, grade gets higher. So we can see that in this plot here. So let's just start over here on the right. So this person, let's just say this is absence here, grade here. This person has a lot of absences. They're really high on absences. Their grade is very low. And then let's just look at the opposite here. Here's a person who has very few absences. They have a high grade. So each of these dots is a person, and that's a negative correlation. In this case, it's perfect because all the dots are right on that line there. I want to check this thing because there was some spinning going on. And then we talk about magnitude, how strong a correlation is. If the dots are going away from that line of a perfect negative correlation, then it's still a correlation, it's just a little bit lower than this one. Sorry about that. And then a low negative correlation, it's not as strong as that the dots are getting further away. So there's still a negative correlation, it's just that it's a little bit more sloppy. There's a little bit more variability here. And then zero correlation means that there's no relationship between there's no relationship between the two variables. So let's just look, hopefully this is a negative correlation. Let me get this off of here. So hopefully the size of your big toe is not related to your grade. If it was, we could just skip all this and we could just measure your toe and give you a grade. So no correlation looks like this. The dots are just everywhere. So toe size is here, grades here. So we have a toe size that's pretty large, and we have people with relatively low grades, middle grades, higher grades. There's medium-sized toes. There's some people who get low grade, middle grade, high grade, and then small toe. Some people get a low grade, some people in the middle, some people a high grade. So there doesn't seem to be any relationship between size of your big toe and grade. There's no correlation. The dots are just everywhere. So the standard line that we get in psychology especially is we say that correlation does not mean causation. Why is that? There could be a third variable. So let's just look at correlation here as an example about where people sit in class and the course grade. And my experience is that there's probably at least a weak positive correlation between these two things. But does sitting somewhere directly cause your grade? Probably not, because there's other variables that are going on. So people who are really interested in the class probably sit up front, right? And the people that are not so engaged are going to sit in the back. So that thing, interest in class, is going to influence where you sit. And it also is going to influence your course grade. So if you're interested in the class, you're going to sit towards the front. And if you're interested in the class, you're probably going to get a higher grade. So when you look at the relationship between where you sit, well, you're sitting up front, you're going to get a higher grade. It seems like there might be a causation, but it isn't. It's being caused by something that impacts both of the other variables. This third variable, interest in class, determines where you sit. It determines your course grade. So really, it's this thing that's deriving the relationship between these two things. It's not that these things are causing each other. So we say in psychology often correlation does not imply correlation does not imply causation, because there could be other things affecting that relationship. However, we need to keep in mind that there's important variables that you can't manipulate. It could be practically or ethically. So let's think about race and ethnicity and gender. These are important variables. We can't practically manipulate it. Of course, it's be unethical too, but we practically can't manipulate it. Ethically, we can't manipulate child rearing behaviors. We can't randomly assign some parents to spank their kids and hit their kids and randomly assign other parents to do other things. That would be unethical. Personality. So somebody's personality, we can't practically change it. Also, we can't ethically change it. I have a final example here of this stuff. It drives me crazy about the smoking and the causing of cancer. For years, the big tobacco companies, those guys would be running around and say that there's no evidence that smoking causes cancer, and they'll usually say humans, or they'll imply that. Yes, that's true, because you can't ethically make people smoke. You can't say you're going to come into my study and randomly you don't smoke anything, you smoke 1 pack a day, you smoke 3 packs a day, you smoke 5 packs a day. You can't do that. It's not ethical. So it's true that there has not been in humans random assignment manipulation of smoking, but there's a bunch of studies that there's a correlation between smoking and cancer. And the other thing too is there's a ton of rat studies and animal studies that we know where people have manipulated the stuff that it causes cancer. So we have to be very careful about this whole business about saying correlation does not mean causation. Also, another point about this is in the real world there's multiple variables. And so in the real world, there's many things happening. So when people do experiments, we'll talk about experiments in a bit. People might study in experiments maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 variables, maybe. And in experiments, what's wrong is that they say, oh, this variable, I manipulated it and it related to this change. And all of a sudden people start acting like that variable is the thing. Well, maybe and maybe not. Because in the real world, there's lots of different things going on. And so we have to be careful about saying that you can only get causation from studying just 1 or 2 variables at a time, because in the real world, that's not how it works. And then sort of the final point I'd like to make is in longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies are when you follow the same people over typically a long period of time, let's say over 20 years. So let's say that you find kids and they're age 3, you do some measurements of various things at age 3, you measure them again at age 5, age 7, age 9, age 11, age 13, age 18, age 23. So you're following the same people over your lives. You can have some pretty good causal arguments that if you see something at age 3 and you correlate it with something that's age 23, there's some fairly strong arguments there, because you have a lot of strong data. Yes, you didn't manipulate anything, but you have 20 years of data that shows that there's this trajectory in how people develop. And so we have to be very careful about just sort of blindly believing this whole thing about correlation does not mean causation. There's different ways of approaching these issues that can help us think about how things are causal in their processes. So I'm adding this slide to tell you to be a little bit careful about doing this knee-jerk reaction of correlation does not mean causation. And I'll give you an example of the longitudinal study. So longitudinal study, I'm going to do my own. So I did I didn't do it. I got data from a study that did this, where they did measure the kids at those ages I just mentioned, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 18, and 23. And so what I did is I looked at the relationship between the personality of these kids at age 3 and then correlating it with the narcissism at age 23. So I had a measure of narcissism at age 23, and I looked at whether there was some preschool, age 3, personality characteristics that predicted somebody becoming more narcissistic when they're age 23. And there was some pretty good, strong correlations. Basically, if they were a little jerk, they were a big jerk when they got older. I know that sounds kind of simplistic, but to show continuity, a relationship over 20 years is pretty substantial. And I can go through a lot of other things. So there's some studies that look at how your relationship is with your primary caregiver when you're 12 months old, and that predicts how you interact with your romantic partners, 20, 30 years later. So there's a whole bunch of things that have been done that shows that there must be some sort of causal process between early childhood stuff and adult stuff. So I just want to say that we can't just sort of say, well, it's correlation, you didn't manipulate things, and basically your study is second rate. No, we don't say that. There's some very important things that we do with this type of a research design. Okay, let's get to experiments. So experiments are things where you manipulate, as the researchers, and you manipulate something to see if it changes behavior, and you do it systematically. So you want to see if any changes that you make affect people's behavior. And in experiments, what you do is you typically take that one, you want to see a variable, and you want to see if it changes people's behavior, and you control all other variables. So everything else is equal. So I'll just give you an example that I use in my stats class. So let's think about, does color affect attraction? So the clothes that you wear, the color of the clothes that you wear, does it affect people's attraction to you? The answer is yes, actually. But basically, you could do an experiment and you could have the same people, and you can manipulate with your computer the color of the shirt they're wearing. So it's the same person, it's the exact same picture, you just change the shirt color from it's red in one condition and it's green in the other. So you could just literally, and we'll just do this with different groups. So one group, so half of your participants see the person in red, and you ask them, how attractive is this person from 1 to 10? And then half your participants will see that same exact person, same exact picture, but they'll be in a green shirt. And then you say, rate this person, how attractive you are to this person. How attractive are they, 1 through 10? Then what you do is you see if the scores are higher, the attraction's higher for the person wearing red versus, I shouldn't say the person, for the red condition, or red shirt versus the green shirt. So that is a good example of experimental research. You're manipulating red versus green for the shirt, but everything else is the same. So how you ask the questions is the same, how you present the picture is the same. The picture is exactly the same. It's just that with the computer, you've manipulated the color of the shirt. So if there's a difference between the red group in terms of attraction versus the green group, then we have fairly strong evidence that the red is making people see this person is more attractive, because everything else is equal. Nothing else differs between the red group and the green group. The only thing that differs is the color of the shirt. Nothing else differs. So if you do that control of all the other variables, and the only thing that differs is your independent variable, so that's what we're getting to here. So the independent variable here is color. Color of the shirt is the independent variable. I've changed it. I present it as either red or green. And by the way, there's 2 levels. Levels is the different types of the independent variable. So if you have color, red and green, that's blue. I'm sorry, that's true. That's two. So you have two levels. You have red and green. I'm getting ahead of myself here. You could have three levels. You could have red, green, and blue. That would be three levels. The independent variable is still the color of the shirt. But in this case, we have three levels. We have red, green, and blue. And we could compare those. We could have 1/3 of our participants see the red shirt, 1/3 see the green, 1/3 see the blue. And we can compare those three groups to see if they differ on attraction to the person. So we manipulate an independent variable to see if it changes behavior. The change in behavior, we'll talk about in a second. The change in behavior in that study is the attraction to the person. So with an IV, oftentimes we'll have what's called an experimental group versus a control group. So in this case, in the study I just talked about, we don't have a control group. We just have different types of colors. So let's do another type of attraction research. And I might talk about this when we get to liking and loving. I'll have to think about it. And so let's just talk about, let's say, alcohol. So there's a concept that's around, and we'll maybe talk about this later in class, about beer goggles. That if you're drunk, you're going to make bad decisions and do things romantically with people that really aren't attractive. Beer goggles. So beer goggles, if we state it specifically in terms of a hypothesis scientifically, the more alcohol you consume, the more attractive you think people are. That would be a scientific statement, hypothesis about beer goggles. So we could do a study and we could have an experimental group and control group. So we could actually bring people in a lab. We could have people, half the people could drink. They come in and we give them, let's say we give them 4 shots. And then we wait for the alcohol to set in, and then we present them with a bunch of pictures. Here, rate the attraction of these people in these pictures. So you might have 10 pictures, and they rate the attraction to those people in the pictures 1 through 10. Then we could have, that's the experimental group. They received the alcohol. They received the IV thing that we think changes behavior, alcohol. That's the experimental. They get the treatment. The treatment is alcohol, the thing that we think changes behavior. And then we'll have half the people be in a control group. Ideally, what we want is something that doesn't have alcohol but smells like alcohol, tastes like alcohol. It's really that's what would be a placebo group. It's a type of control group. So there's no alcohol there. So we're having them drink that stuff, and we're pretending it's alcohol, and we're hoping to fool them that it's alcohol, but it has no alcohol. There's nothing in it. That's a control group. So that's the difference between experimental and control. Experimental, alcohol. Control, there's no alcohol. Again, we do the comparison of those two groups. So if that hypothesis is correct, the beer goggles hypothesis, then our people who are drinking should give higher attraction ratings to the photos versus the people who don't drink. And then the other variable, so we talked about the IV, the thing that we're manipulating to see if it changes behavior, but we haven't talked about the term for what is that behavior called. It's called dependent variable. So in both the studies we just talked about just now, the dependent variable, the DV, is attraction. That's the thing that we measure to see if there is a change in behavior based on our IV levels. So again, we're trying to establish a cause and effect between the IV and the DV. So cause and effect between colors. Does the color red produce more attraction versus green and blue? Does alcohol produce more attraction versus no alcohol? So that's the IV-DV connection in experimental research. So there's things we need to do. Remember, we have to control things in experiments because the only thing that we want differing is the IV. The only thing we want differing is whether they see red or green or blue. Or we only want the only thing differing is they have alcohol or they don't. Everything else should be equal between those groups. So one of the things we want to do is we want to make sure, for example, in that attraction stuff, let's just say in those attraction studies, we know that there's some people, you probably know friends like this, people differ, right? There's some people who are very picky. Everybody's a 2. Everybody's a 2. They don't look looking. They're very picky about stuff. Then we know people who are very not picky. I envy that. Everybody's a 9. Oh my gosh, everybody's so beautiful. That's great. And there's quite a few of us that are probably in the middle. We're in between picky and not picky. And so when we have our groups, let's just take the alcohol, since I used that as 2 groups, alcohol versus no alcohol. We don't want a bunch of picky people in the no alcohol group and a bunch of not picky people in the alcohol group, because the not picky people will have high scores and the picky people have low scores. So if we have more picky people in the not alcohol group and more not picky in the alcohol group will be higher just because there's more not picky people in it. And we'll look at it and we'll say, oh my gosh, alcohol makes people look more attractive. No, it's not. It's because there was more non-picky people in the alcohol group. So we want to make sure that those types of variables that can influence the DV, obviously picky, not picky, influences the attraction ratings. We don't want that differing between the 2 groups, because if it does differ, it's really that is making the difference between the 2 groups. It's not the alcohol. So what we want to do is we want to do random assignment. What does random assignment mean? It means that if you have 2 groups, alcohol and not alcohol group, every single person has a 50-50 chance. There's a 50% chance they'll be in the alcohol group. There's a 50% they'll be in the not alcohol group. So if you have a large enough sample and you do random assignment, more likely than not, the picky, not picky people, or not picky difference is going to even out between the 2 groups. I'm going to check if there's something here. Nope. I'll talk about that in a second. So again, that's just an example. So all those things and there could be other things too. I just talked about the picky, not picky. There's all these different things that could affect attraction ratings. Let's think about them. It could be, what if you just broke up with your boyfriend, girlfriend? Let's just say you hate dating, you hate relationships because of that. Your attraction ratings might be horrible. Let's say you just fell in love with somebody. Maybe your attraction ratings are going to be higher. Let's say that you were driving and it's in the winter and it's raining hard and you got a flat tire and you couldn't get anybody to help you. You had to go out, you had to change your tire, you're soaked. You stepped in every single puddle that is on the sidewalk going to the experiment. You come into the experiment. What are your attraction ratings going to be like? Probably horrible. You're in a bad mood. Let's say it's a great day. It's a sunny day and butterflies are landing on your shoulder and you're finding like $100 bills laying on the ground. You're in a great mood. Your attraction ratings? Probably going to be pretty high. So there's all these things. It's not just picky, not picky. There's a bunch of things that could influence the attraction ratings. That's not part of the study. You're bringing that stuff into the lab. So by doing random assignment, if your sample size is large enough and you truly randomly assign people, probably you're going to equalize all that stuff. All of those things, breakups and falling in love, good day, bad day, all these things will be equalized via random assignment. So if you have those things equalized, if there's a difference between the group, then it's because of the alcohol versus not alcohol, because of your IV. I already gave an example. I'm not going to give an example there. I'm going to go back here. Sorry about that. I just want to add a footnote. There's another sort of higher level of assigning people to conditions or groups, and that's called matching. So let's say there's something I know can affect results. I can measure that and I can make sure that it's equalized. So let's say that I know that pickiness is going to influence the people's attraction ratings. I could, let's say, and this would be great beforehand, so I know I have my people and they're going to be coming to my lab. Maybe a week or two before the study, I send them a survey, like an online thing. And I say, click on this. And so they click on it, and then there's pictures of people. So there's like, let's say there's 20 people. So they rate the attraction of the people 1 through 10. It's not part of my experiment, but I'm measuring their pickiness, because I know if they have a higher score, they're less picky. If they have a lower score, they're more picky. It's the same people in the pictures. And so I could actually measure their pickiness, and I can match it in my groups. Matching just basically means that I have 2 groups. I have the alcohol and not alcohol. So let's say I have a really picky person, and there's another picky person. I make sure I put 1 picky person in the alcohol, 1 picky person in the not alcohol. I have a not picky person and another not picky person. One of those not picky goes in alcohol, one of the not picky goes in the alcohol. And so we can measure that and can match the level of pickiness and just split those people into the 2 groups. So if somebody's really picky, match them with another person who's picky, and you split them into the 2 groups. One's in the alcohol, one's in not alcohol. So this is called matching, where you actually measure, usually quickly, you measure something you know will influence your DV, your attraction ratings, and you just make sure you equalize it by saying you guys are on the same level. One goes here, one group, the other one goes in the other group. So it's a little bit higher level of assigning people to groups to make sure that you equalize them on something you know will influence your findings. So just look at this study. You can read it. You can pause this. I recommend that you pause this. Can you identify the IV, the independent variables, and the DVs in this study? So pause this and unpause it when you're ready. Okay, so looks like the DV here is how long it helps people, or how long it takes people to help this person out. So we have a person working for us on crutches, and they drop their crutches. And the DV is how long does it take for somebody to help them? How long does it take for somebody to pick up those crutches? What are the IVs though? That's the DV, that's the outcome. What are the IVs? So it looks like there's 2. One is that there's when they encountered the woman. So for half the people, they encountered the woman before watching the movie, and half the people, they encounter her after. So half before the movie, half after. And the movie is also manipulated. So half the people see a violent movie, and half the people see a non-violent movie. So we actually have 4 groups, if you will. And those are IVs. So you're manipulating that. So you are controlling whether they encounter her before or after the movie. You're manipulating that. That's an IV. You also are manipulating a violent versus not violent movie. That's also an IV. We actually end up with 4 groups. So we have people who encounter her before, who see a non-violent movie. So before, non-violent is this. And then we have the violent movie before. So both of these are before. This is non-violent, this is violent. And then we have the after. So this is non-violent and then violent. So we have 4 groups. We have a before, non-violent, before violent, after non-violent, after violent. And basically these are the results. And the DV, the helping, we're measuring the delay in helping. So this doesn't mean that they help more. This means that they have a bigger delay in when they help the person. So we are going to actually look at this a little bit and interpret this. So it might seem complicated at first, but let's just take it simply. So when I look at this, let's look at the before versus after. So before is here, these 2. After is these 2. So let's say we average these 2 to get a before. So it's around here. And then we're going to average these 2, because that's after. It'd be about here. I don't think there's a lot of difference between the before and after. So the average is here, and the average is here. It's not a big difference. So it looks like, to me, it looks like before versus after doesn't make much of a difference. So I'm just taking the average of these two and the average of these two. They don't look too big of a difference to me. Let's look at the other IV. The other IV is violent versus not violent. So to do that, we take the average of the white bars. So if we average the white bars, we'd be about here. So this one and this one, because that's the non-violent one. So we're basically averaging it. We're ignoring the before and after. We'll just average those two. And then let's look at the violent movie. So we can average that too. So we look at the shaded bars here. The average looks like it would be about here. So the average of the violent would be about here. The average of the not violent here. I'd say that could be a difference. So just kind of looking at that, I'd say that looks like there is a difference between non-violent and violent, with non-violent being quicker at helping because it's lower here. They have less of a delay. So non-violent movie seems to be leading people to help her more quickly versus violent. But there's another big thing here is that we want to, I'm going to go back on this, what's called an interaction. Interaction means that, okay, we looked at whether before and after makes a difference, ignoring the violent versus not violent movie. Then we looked at the non-violent movie versus violent, ignoring before and after. But now an interaction says that, do those two variables work together? So does the before after work together with the violent, not violent to influence behavior? And yes, it does. So if we look at after the movie, so after they've watched the movie, it looks to me here that if you watch the non-violent movie, you're even faster. So here, this is before the movie, but if you've watched the non-violent movie, you're actually quite a bit faster. So after the movie seems to have an effect on non-violent movie watchers being quicker helpers. And then here, it looks like, whoa, the violent movie really pushed up the line here. So we went from here to here. So it looks to me like the violent movie watchers were even more delayed in helping the person. So it looks like there's an interaction that after the movie actually impacts quite a bit in terms of whether you help or not. So that's called interaction. So I know that some of these terms might be a little bit coming at you fast. Don't worry. Just kind of think about them. So factorial design is just simply saying you have more than one independent variable. So here you have a factorial design because you have a before and after as an independent variable, and you have the violent and not violent. That's another independent variable. You have two independent variables. So you have more than one independent variable. It's called factorial. It's just a fancy way of saying you have more than one independent variable. So we already talked about the effect of each IV. So we already said that the non-violent versus the violent seems to have there seems to be a difference. So if we average the clear bars and we average the shaded bar, there seems to be a difference between those two. So the IV of non-violent versus violent movie seems to have an impact on behavior. We looked at also before and after. So if we average before, we're right here. We average after, it's probably about right here. They don't look very different here. There's really only maybe a quarter of a second or less difference. So the effect of the IV of before and after doesn't have an impact. So before or after, there's no difference. Violent versus non-violent, there seems to be an effect in the sense that violent movie watchers are slower. But what's really important is the interaction. So it looks like after the movie, we have a big impact of violent versus not violent. After the movie, there's a huge difference. The non-violent people are much faster, or I shouldn't say much, but non-violent people are faster at helping than any other group. And the violent group is much slower than any other group in terms of helping. So there seems to be an interaction that the impact on helping is after the movie has been seen. So hopefully that makes some sense. There's biases in any sort of research, so in experimental research. So extraneous variables, so if there's something going on that's changing, that's not the IV, that can impact the DV, that's really bad. Because if something else is happening, or is affecting the DV and we aren't aware of it, we might make wrong conclusions. So I already talked about the picky, not picky. So let's say there's picky, not picky. So if we have more picky people in the no alcohol group and there's more not picky in the alcohol group, that's an extraneous variable. It's affecting the ratings of attraction. And it's not our IV. But it's really dangerous because it looks like our alcohol is having an impact. We say alcohol has a big impact on attraction, but not really. It's because there was that extraneous variable of picky, not picky. There's also something called demand characteristics. So this is basically somebody picks up and they want to be a good subject. Let's say we do the study of alcohol, not alcohol. It'd be really bad if you as the experimenter knows the difference. So if you know it's alcohol, you're going to act in a way that triggers the person to act differently. Like, oh, here's some photos. It could be even subtle. So if they pick up that them drinking should mean that they should be more attracted to people, that's a demand characteristic. They pick up that you want them to act differently because of the condition you're in, alcohol versus no alcohol. So that's called demand characteristics. There's also something called social desirability. This is really more in the case with questionnaires. So if you do questionnaires, you have to be very careful because oftentimes people will answer those questionnaires to make themselves look good in terms of socially desirable characteristics. So when I study narcissism through observational reports because I don't really like doing self-reports because I think self-reports leads to social desirability. So you probably wouldn't ask this question, but actually there are questions like this. I've seen questions like this on narcissism questionnaires. Like the question will say something like, I'm better than everybody else. Well, that's not really desirable, really. Most people we're told that we shouldn't be so arrogant. So that could be a bad measure because there could be a social desirability to say no to that, even though you are a narcissist. So we have to be a little bit careful about that, especially with questionnaires. We already talked about the thing that attitudes oftentimes don't match behaviors, but let's look at some specific things here. Let's look at expectancy effects. So this is a little bit complicated definition, but expectancy effects is kind of what we were talking about before with demand characteristics. So if you know that the experimenter thinks that alcohol is going to lead to more attraction than no alcohol, you could do some subtle things if you know that the person has alcohol to make them act like they're more attracted to people. And if you know that they're not in the alcohol group, they're no alcohol, you'll act differently with them. So you have to be very careful. We don't want to act differently with the different groups that will influence the DV. And this stuff can be pretty subtle. So we have to be very careful about these effects. The placebo effects. Basically, it means that, this is what I was saying earlier about the alcohol versus no alcohol. The control group would be that they wouldn't drink anything, but I don't think that's a good way of doing that study because it's so obvious that they haven't drank anything. If you really want to test whether alcohol makes a difference, you give them a placebo. You pretend it's alcohol. It tastes like alcohol. It smells like alcohol, but there is absolutely no alcohol in it. So I think that's a better design because we want to see if there's a placebo effect because you probably know this. And I don't recommend doing this at all, but you could probably think that if you invited your friends over, and let's say you watered down the alcohol a lot, but your friends are thinking they're going to drinking alcohol, how do you think they're going to act? They're going to act like they're drinking alcohol, right? Even though there's no alcohol in it. Because we think, oh, we drink alcohol, we act this way. So I want to do this study as a placebo because I know that people will think alcohol changes their behavior, and I think it gives them an excuse to act stupid. So in terms of attraction, oh, it was just a beer, oh, it's nothing. So I want to make sure that it's not the expectations of how alcohol impacts your behavior that is going on. I want to make sure it's the alcohol itself that's changing behavior. So placebo designs are pretty good because we want to make sure that it's not people's expectation that's changing their behavior, it's the actual thing that's changing the behavior. So in this case, alcohol. So we're almost to the end here of this first lecture. So real quick little thing about ethics and research. So when you do research, you're, with the exception of those naturalistic observations I told you about, so if you're watching people touch each other in coffee shops, and I'm talking about the research I talked about, I'm not talking about being a pervert and going around and looking at people. But in terms of research, you can legitimately go to naturalistic settings and watch people, and you don't give informed consent because it has to be usually public behavior. So something that's public behavior, you don't need to give informed consent. But if you're doing an experiment, you have to. So like with the alcohol and not alcohol, you would actually have to say something like, you may be given alcohol. Because, some people can't handle alcohol. So you would, if I did that study, I'd say, there's a possibility that you will be given alcohol to drink. I won't tell them that they are going to be in the alcohol or not alcohol group, but I'm going to tell them, you're going to be possibly drinking some alcohol. And you're going to be looking at some photos and rating their attraction. So I'm just going to tell them, what the study is about and tell them what they possibly might encounter. That's informed consent. And so you inform them roughly what you're going to be doing, possibilities in the research, and then they consent to it. Usually you have them sign something because you usually don't want something to come back to you and they'll say that you didn't do it. You have them sign something. Deception means that you deceive the person. So deception would be for example, the placebo with the alcohol. So I'm deceiving people. I'm pretending it's alcohol, but it's not really. So deception is when you are deceiving your participants. You're not being fully truthful. It can be about the purpose of the study, or it could be about things like that, about what they are encountering. The Milgram study that we talked about earlier. So the Milgram study, for example, you're deceiving the person. You're telling them, oh, you're going to come in here and I'm going to randomly assign you to learner and teacher. And then what happens is that the learner is part of your study. They're part of your group. And they're going to make like they're dying. So you're actually deceiving the participant. You're making the participant think they're killing somebody else through these shocks. That's major deception. So that's what deception is. So if you're lying to or misleading your participants, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to debrief them. So you debrief them under any circumstances. So even if you were pretty upfront, like, oh, you might have alcohol and I'll have you rate photos and your informed consent, you're going to still debrief them. You're going to say, oh, I was just curious if alcohol affected people's attraction, etc. But the debriefing is especially important if there's deception. So in the Milgram, and I think we might see films about this, the debriefing is simply they actually bring the learner, like when they had the conditions of the learner being in another room, it's like, oh, you thought he was dead? Here he is. He's alive. So you say, oh, he was working with me. He's part of the experiment. He didn't get any shocks. He's not hurt. Don't worry about that. So you do that. You do a type of debriefing, and then you say that the study was about a conformity or obedience, and you wanted to see if people were told that they had to go on, how far they would go in terms of the shock. So you give them a debriefing, and usually just like the informed consent, the debriefing you typically want to have written, and you don't have them sign it, you just give it to them, and you say, well, here's this about. And you usually offer them to see the publication if it's published. So you'll say something like, if you want to see the results of this, I'll send you it. If there's any study, I'll send you it. My experience is that nobody has ever asked for that. So I'm not saying it's never happened, but I'd say it's rare. And it mentions the IRB here, Institutional Review Board. What is that? So Institutional Review Board is, the point of an Institutional Review Board is that you as a researcher cannot judge the ethics of your study. So just like trying to find findings that conform or confirm your hypotheses, there's a bias there. There's also a bias in terms of ethics. So you are not a good judge of whether what you're doing is ethical or not. You cannot be the judge of the ethics of your study. So Institutional Review Board is a group of people, and they're going to review your study. So before you do your study, you submit all of your research. You say you want to say what you're doing briefly. You say what your research question is, what your hypothesis is, how you're going to use the data, what the data will tell you, what the findings will tell you about humans. And the most important part, though, is you have your whole protocol. So you'll say everything that you'll do with the participants. So how you'll greet them and what the participant will be doing. If you have a questionnaire, you'll have all your questions from the questionnaire in the proposal. If you do experimental manipulations, you'll describe very specifically what you'll be doing to the people. If you have deception, you'll have to explain what deception you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to debrief people to make sure that they aren't ill-affected by the manipulation, the deception. So all of this stuff, everything you're going to be doing with a person is reviewed by a group of people. And this group of people should be varied. The group of people should include other researchers who kind of know research ethics. It should also include, if you're in a college, it will often include a student, because in universities or colleges, oftentimes their participants are students. And so you probably want a student on there because the student should give a perspective of, well, there's a lot of student participants, I want to give you a perspective from the participants. And you should at least have one other person from outside of the institution. I say institution, it's not just colleges or universities that should have this. It could be anybody that's conducting research should have this. And there's usually separate IRBs for people doing research on animals versus people who do research on humans, because there's different ethical standards between those two, with usually a much higher standard for the animals in some ways, because people can give informed consent. And then the IRB can oftentimes have ad hoc members, which means you add people for specific things. So let's say that somebody wanted to do a research on prisoners, and so I probably want on the IRB, I probably want maybe the warden or deputy warden of a prison on my IRB. I probably want an ex-con, an ex-prisoner, or even a current prisoner possibly on the IRB, because I want to make sure that nothing's being violated there in terms of ethics. So you can also add specific people for specific research studies if you feel like it will give you the perspectives that you need about the ethical issues. So what the IRB basically does, it reads through your proposal about how you're going to do the study, and they say yes, no, or maybe. So they can say yes, and sometimes the yes is just change these two small things, and you change the two small things, and that's it. You can go ahead. So sometimes they say, well, there's just a couple things we want you to change. Just change those things, and you can go ahead from that. There's no's, so they could say, listen, this is messed up. No, go off and think of another design for the study to test your research questions, because you cannot do this one, and there's no leeway here. It's just totally wrong. I think that's relatively rare. I think most researchers are pretty savvy, I hope, about ethics. The more likely thing, I shouldn't say the more likely, the yes, go ahead with small changes is fairly common in what we call research that is minimal risk. Minimal means nothing, doesn't mean no. Minimal means it's like everyday behavior. So when I do my, where I have done my relationship research, so I have brought people in and they talk about in interviews their romantic relationships, and I code that. I have them fill out some questionnaires about romantic relationships. I have them do some card sorting to describe their personality. All these things were minimal risk because people talk about their relationships every day, and asking somebody about their personality, you know, are you this way or that way? It's kind of like everyday stuff. So when I've done research like that, it's been pretty much like, looks fine, just make these couple small changes and go ahead. There is also a possibility where they say, okay, it looks good, but we want these changes, and you need to show us those changes before you go on. So I've done research on transgender identity development, and that research was that outcome. So I would submit it, and they say, okay, this is a protected population, so that it's considered a vulnerable population, in the sense that because of societal views and discrimination and things like this, is that trans people are more vulnerable, therefore they deserve more protection in terms of ethical issues. And so when I did that research, I remember it was yes, but yes, you can't continue until you do these changes. And so I had to make the changes, and I submitted it not to the whole board, but there was a chairperson, and the chairperson understood all of the issues that needed to be addressed. And so I think I had probably 6 revisions. And so I would go and revise my stuff. I would send it back, and they'd say, oh, this looks, AB looks okay, but CDE needs to be changed. And so after a handful of revisions, I finally got the stamp of approval. And you know, in some ways, as a researcher, you think, oh, this is a little bit overboard, or oh my gosh. But at the same time, you realize that you cannot be the judge of your own research. So sometimes, even though it kind of seems like it's a hassle, sometimes you have to say, listen, in the end, I know that I cannot be the judge of my research. And the reason why we have IRBs is because of things like 2 infamous social psychological studies. So there's the Milgram study that I talked about already, and there's also the Stanford prison study. So the Milgram study, we talked about that already, and I don't think I need to repeat it. But the Stanford prison study, you may have heard about this. If you took intro psych, you probably heard about it. Even if you didn't take any psych classes, you may have heard about this because it's pretty popular in culture in general. And also there was a Hollywood movie about it a couple years ago, and it might be on Netflix or something like that, so you may have caught that. But essentially, and we'll look at this in more detail later in the semester, but basically at Stanford, Phil Zimbardo, a researcher professor there, wanted to study essentially the effects of roles on people's behaviors. And so what he did is he took a bunch of Stanford students that were the same. They were all undergraduates, and they were smart, and they were psychologically healthy. So they screened them. And then what they did is they randomly assigned people to be either a guard or a prisoner. So people were randomly assigned to be a prisoner or a guard. And so the prisoners, they were actually picked up, we'll see this later in the semester, but they were picked up by the Stanford Palo Alto, I should say. I think it was the Palo Alto, or it might have been the Stanford University Police. I don't know if it was the University Police or the Palo Alto Municipal Police, but they actually arranged for them to actually do arrests. So they came to the person's house or dorm or whatever, and they would arrest them in front of everybody, and they would put them in a cop car, and then they would process them like a prisoner, more or less. They would fingerprint them, and they made them wear prisoner clothes. And then the people who were guards got guard orientation, and they were given guard uniforms and other symbols of being a guard. So it was random whether you would be a guard or a prisoner. And the ethical issues there is that, actually, I'll show this. So we already talked about the Milgram experiment. This is the Milgram experiment where people thought they were basically killing the other person. And so there was, it was seen as pretty unethical because they were being deceived pretty severely. and all they did debrief people. And when they had the debriefing, people were laughing and things like that. But they followed up on these people, and they seem to have some pretty bad psychological effects from the study. Knowing that you could kill somebody pretty easily is not an easy thing to deal with. And then the Zimbardo one, it went overboard. So the guards were mistreating the prisoners. This, I believe, is the bathroom break. And so the prison was in the basement, and there was no facilities there. And the guards, I think, decided that the prisoners should never see the light of day. And so when they had to use the bathroom, they had to go to the ground floor. And you can see that there's windows there, and they could see the sun. And so the guards decided that prisoners should never see the light of day, that they should just only see their prison in the basement. And so when they went to the bathroom, they would actually force the prisoners to wear bags over their heads. And so they would be leading them blindly with bags on their heads to the bathroom. So they couldn't see anything except when they were in the bathroom. I believe they took the bags off and had them use the bathroom facilities. But that's all they saw was the prison and the bathroom. They couldn't see this apparently nice little lobby hallway here with sunlight and chairs on the side here. So really kind of abusing the prisoners and dehumanizing them. And then things like this. So I'm pretty sure we're gonna hear, I don't think we actually see and hear this. So there is an incident where somebody misbehaved, and the guards decided to make an example of this prisoner, and you can see that they're blindfolding this person, even in the basement. And they forced this person, I think they kept them blindfolded, and they basically forced them to stay in a broom closet. So you couldn't sit down in this thing. So you had to either stand or kind of, I guess, wedge your body on the wall somehow, but you couldn't sit on the floor because there's no room. It's for brooms. And so they put this person in there. They call it solitary, I think. And then there's a scene we'll see where the guards say to the other prisoners, this guy is in there because of this thing. And basically what the guards said, it's really kind of sick. They said to the other prisoners is that, we'll make a deal with you. We'll let this guy out, but you're going to give us your blankets. And it's in the basement. It's pretty cold. Sleep down there. Or you can keep your blankets, and this guy's going to spend the next 12 hours in that closet. You can guess what happens. We'll see in the film what happens in terms of what the prisoners choose. But really messed up stuff like that. And what happened, as we'll see in the real videos, we're not going to watch the film. You can watch the Hollywood film if you want, which is relatively accurate. But in the real video, we'll see this. People are having breakdowns. People are really having severe stress reactions, breaking down mentally and emotionally, crying, yelling, just kind of losing it. Wasn't ethical. And one of the big things that was unethical, this was before IRBs. So Zimbardo, and he'll admit this himself, he was acting like a warden. So he didn't really care about the misery that the prisoners were going through. He thought this was fantastic, that this was the greatest social psychology experiment ever, and look at the power of the situation. Look what I'm doing to these people. So he only sort of cared about his research and about keeping the order, if you will. He didn't realize bad things were happening. We'll watch a film and we'll find out how he realized bad things were happening from the people who were there. So IRB is largely, I wouldn't say largely, there's other bad things that people have done, but in terms of social psychology, these are probably the two most infamous and also the most talked about experiments in social psychology, and they also led to IRBs. That people saying that we can't leave you as researchers as your own judge for your ethics. And I think that's it. So that's it for the first week of class, and we'll See you in the second week of class. Take care.